At 20,000 feet the world turned simple. White glare above, white cloud below, and between them a moving factory of aluminum and noise. The bomber stream held formation with the discipline of machinery, wings level, contrails stitched into straight lines, engines droning in a harmony that made distance feel like safety. From up here, Europe was not a continent. It was a map that had been folded shut. Inside the lead aircraft, the navigator lived by numbers: headings, airspeed, estimated time en route. Small certainties stacked against a sky that refused to be read. He checked his course again and again, pencil tapping at the chart, then at the compass, then at the drift meter. Each confirmation steadied the crew. Each confirmation also pushed doubt down into the floorboards where fear was supposed to stay. The bombardier waited for the moment when the war became a switch. His sight, glass and metal calibrated for precision, rested on cloud tops that looked smooth enough to be harmless. Somewhere beneath that broken ceiling was the target, described in briefing rooms with confident phrases: rail junction, industrial works, German city. Somewhere was not a word used in official orders, but it was the word that haunted every man who stared at an invisible ground. Then the clouds opened, not fully, not kindly, just enough to offer a glimpse that felt like permission. A river curved like a dark ribbon. A rail line cut across it, straight and certain. A town clustered around the tracks, roofs pale in the winter light. It looked familiar in the way landmarks look from too high, close enough to believe, too far to truly know. In the cockpit, that brief window became a verdict. They had found it. "Bombs away," the bombardier said, and the words landed with practiced calm. Routine was the armor of daylight bombing. Routine made the impossible task manageable: fly, identify, release, turn, survive. The bombs dropped cleanly, a mechanical release that felt like a procedure rather than an act. For a few seconds, there was even relief. Relief that the aircraft was lighter, relief that the mission had been executed, relief that the war had stayed inside its assigned boundaries. But seconds later, the ground answered in the wrong language. Smoke rose where smoke should not have been, blooming not from an enemy factory, but from ordinary streets, from roofs that carried no swastika, from a town that had believed neutrality could be a kind of shelter. The plume did not look different from above. It never does. It was only the meaning that changed. This is the terror of industrial war. The mistake is not small. It is not measured in inches on a chart or degrees on a compass. It is measured in houses, in tram lines, in hospital corridors, in the sudden arithmetic of names. And as the formation droned onward, already committed to the return flight, the question began to form in the silence between engine notes. If even a neutral town could be struck from the sky, what did neutrality truly protect against? Switzerland entered the Second World War as a neutral state, but neutrality is a legal position, not a geographic miracle. On the map it sat like a small, carefully guarded island, yet it was not surrounded by water. It was surrounded by the Axis and Axis-held territory, pressed against borders that could be crossed by an army on foot, yet in the age of long-range aviation, crossed even more easily by a formation that never intended to come. From the air, Switzerland's sky became something no treaty could fully control: a corridor. Allied bombers sometimes cut corners to save fuel or to avoid known flak belts and fighter concentrations. Sometimes they drifted, pushed by high winds at altitude, their calculated track sliding a few miles off course until a border was crossed without a single man feeling the moment it happened. Neutral airspace in practice became a margin of error, thin as a pencil line on a chart, yet wide enough to hold entire towns. On the ground, the war announced itself with sirens. At first, people listened with the sharp attention of those who know history can change in a day. But alarms repeated. Aircraft passed overhead and kept going. No bombs fell. Then it happened again and again, until some families began to treat the warning like weather, something to be noted, endured, and forgotten. A mother might pause at a window, count the engines by ear, and decide whether to keep the kettle on. In a country built on preparedness, even fear could become routine. That is the first irony of the story. Neutrality can keep an army out, but it cannot keep a war's mistakes away. The modern battlefield was no longer only where soldiers stood, it was also where navigators guessed, where clouds erased landmarks, where decisions were made in seconds above unseen streets. A sovereign border could be honored on paper and violated in the same hour by a formation that believed it was obeying orders perfectly. Swiss air defenses lived inside this contradiction. To defend sovereignty, they had to be ready to fire. But to fire too readily risked provoking retaliation from either side, Germany, nearby and vengeful, or the Allies, powerful and convinced of their moral necessity. Every unidentified aircraft became a dilemma: accident, intrusion, or prelude. And above it all, in Allied cockpits, the mental picture was dangerously simple. Germany is below us. At altitude, with cloud hiding the ground and instruments insisting on certainty, the sky encouraged that belief. The shock is not merely that bombs can fall on the wrong place. It is that the safest country in Europe became vulnerable to the most modern weapon of all, miscalculation. And the war was only beginning to test how often it could happen. Back at base, the returning crews stepped into the familiar aftertaste of a mission: cold air on flushed faces, the smell of oil and exhaust on flight suits, the long walk from aircraft to interrogation rooms. Inside, the debriefing tables filled with maps and forms, and the room itself filled with cigarette smoke and confidence. Men spoke in the shorthand of routine, flak was moderate, fighters were few, bombs appeared on target. The war, at least in memory, had gone according to plan. Then the first contradictory report arrived, and the tone changed without anyone needing to raise his voice. It might begin as a question from intelligence, a message from higher headquarters, a quiet interruption at the far end of the room. The paperwork that usually confirmed success now carried an unfamiliar unease. In a system built to turn chaos into neat summaries, contradiction was a kind of alarm. A place name was spoken that did not belong to the mission. Not the German city on the briefing board, not the rail yard circled in red pencil. Schaffhausen, Zurich, Basel. Names that sounded Swiss, names that carried neutrality inside them like a seal. For a moment, men looked at one another as if language itself had gone wrong. Switzerland was not supposed to be part of the narrative. It was background. It was the blank space between enemies. For the navigator, the shock was physical. His stomach dropped as if the aircraft had suddenly lost altitude again. He replayed the flight in his mind with a precision that had failed him in the air. The headings, the timed turns, the wind that had pushed them sideways while the compass remained politely honest. He thought of drift calculations and the way cloud cover had erased the ground, leaving only instruments and faith. Numbers can be correct and still lead you to the wrong town. In modern war, mathematics does not guarantee morality. And then the sentence began to spread, half defense, half disbelief, repeated with the same weary rhythm from crew to crew. We thought we were over Germany. It sounded reasonable, almost comforting, because it implied intention was intact. Yet it also exposed something terrifying. At bombing altitude, belief can become indistinguishable from fact. You can be certain and still be wrong. Commanders understood immediately that this was more than embarrassment. This was diplomacy, legitimacy, and a neutral nation's anger arriving through official channels. The Allied air war depended not only on tonnage dropped, but on the idea that it was guided by purpose and restraint. A bomb falling on Switzerland did not merely kill civilians, it threatened the moral architecture the war effort claimed to defend. This is the promise of the story, to follow how a precision war created a pattern of errors, and how those errors forced policy to change, not because war became kinder, but because consequences became unavoidable. And to understand how it happened, we have to rewind to the moment before doubt, back to belief, when confidence felt like a weapon all its own. The Allied doctrine of daylight bombing was presented as a modern form of certainty, an argument that the age of blind destruction could be replaced by method. In briefing rooms and training fields, officers spoke of technology as if it were a moral upgrade. Tight formations, disciplined crews, and bomb sites engineered to turn industrial war into something measurable. The promise was simple and attractive. If you could see the target, you could strike the target. If you could strike the target, you could shorten the war. So crews were trained to trust systems more than instincts. Instruments, checklists, radio calls, formation signals. These became the scaffolding that held men steady at altitude, where fear could spread faster than oxygen disappears. Doubt was treated as a hazard, the same as icing or flak. A pilot who questioned too much could drift out of formation. A bombardier who hesitated could miss the brief moment when the target lay centered in his sight. In the air, certainty was not just confidence, it was survival. On the practice range, the lesson became physical. A bombardier lay behind the Norden bomb site, one eye pressed to glass, the other closed against distraction, his fingers adjusting knobs that felt too small for the consequences they controlled. He learned that a tiny correction at 20,000 feet could move impact points by entire city blocks. The mathematics was clean, the earth was not. The instructors praised precision as a craft, something learned through repetition until the hand moved without argument. In that repetition, a dangerous comfort was born, the belief that technique could domesticate violence. Command did more than teach a method, it sold an idea. Precision, they said, meant fewer civilian deaths. Precision meant factories instead of homes, rail yards instead of schools. In a war that had already shown what area bombing could do, this doctrine offered moral leverage, a way to claim that destruction was not only necessary, but controlled. Precision became a justification as much as a procedure. To bomb by daylight was to present the war as rational, even when it was brutal. But precision was never a single invention. It was a chain, and every link depended on conditions the enemy and the weather could steal. It required visibility, so that the target could be identified. It required navigation, so that the aircraft reached the correct city in the first place. It required timing, so bombs were released at the exact moment the site demanded. In theory, these were solvable problems. In practice, war specialized in unsolving them. Clouds turned a planned strike into guesswork. Smoke from earlier raids blurred landmarks into smudges. Flak forced bombers to weave and climb, bending the clean geometry of bomb runs into nervous arcs. Fighters broke formations, and broken formations broke certainty. Even when the instruments were working, wind drift could shift a bomber stream sideways mile after mile, until the ground below no longer matched the briefing map. The bombers could be following procedure perfectly while approaching the wrong place. Yet belief hardens quickly when an entire machine depends on it. When the paperwork said target, men wanted the target to be there. When the bombs were already loaded and the fuel already burned, there was pressure to make the mission real, to convert effort into results. That is where faith becomes arrogance, not the arrogance of cruelty, but the arrogance of assumption. The assumption that the plan must be correct, because the plan is all you have. And once that mindset takes hold, the most dangerous sentence in the air becomes possible. Germany is below us, even when it is not. Because the sky does not carry borders, and cloud does not respect neutrality. What the doctrine promised was control. What it quietly created was a system where a single mistaken certainty could travel in formation, toward a country that believed borders still mattered. Swiss neutrality in the Second World War was not a sentimental pose. It was a policy backed by readiness, rehearsed like a drill, and maintained with a discipline that had been refined over generations. Airfields were kept active, anti-aircraft guns positioned to protect key approaches, and citizens mobilized through a system that assumed the worst precisely so the worst might be deterred. In a continent where borders were being rewritten by tanks, Switzerland treated its own borders as something that must be defended daily, quietly, stubbornly, and without theatrical claims. In Bern, leaders believed sovereignty could be preserved through strict rules applied without emotion. Belligerent aircraft that landed on Swiss soil would be interned. Crews would be treated according to law, not according to the flags on their wings. Borders would be guarded, airspace asserted, and provocations avoided, because neutrality depended on restraint as much as on strength. The Swiss state could not afford to appear weak, but it also could not afford to appear eager. It walked a narrow ridgeline, defend without inviting punishment from either side. That ridgeline was felt most sharply by the men who had to interpret the sky. A Swiss officer on duty might hear engines before he saw them, the sound rolling across valleys like distant thunder. He would step outside, look up, and search the haze for silhouettes, twin tails, 4 engines, or the thin shape of a fighter. In those seconds, an entire nation's posture rested on a judgment call. Were they lost? Was it a violation? Or was it the first wave of an attack? In the air, recognition could be delayed by cloud. On the ground, hesitation could be fatal. Among the public, there was faith of a different kind, the mountain logic that had shaped Swiss identity. Switzerland was hard to invade. It could withdraw into valleys and passes, into tunnels and fortified lines, and make conquest expensive. People believed that even if the war raged around them, the geography itself offered a kind of protection. The country had survived the last great European catastrophe without being overrun. Many assumed it would survive this one the same way, by being prepared, by being resolute, and by being too difficult to swallow. But this is where the second irony enters the story. Air power does not require invasion to cause devastation. It does not need infantry to cross a border or armor to grind through a pass. It needs only a release point, only a moment when a man above the clouds believes he has found the target. The mountains that discouraged armies did not discourage bombs. They did not stop a formation from drifting. They did not stop a bombardier from trusting a river that looked like another river. As the war intensified, Swiss skies grew crowded with the consequences of other nations' battles. Damaged aircraft limped across borders seeking somewhere, anywhere, safe to land. Fighters chased bombers, bombers fled fighters, and both sometimes spilled into neutral airspace in panic or confusion. Stray formations appeared like ghosts, then vanished again. Emergency landings became more frequent. Internment camps became a quiet footnote to the air war. Switzerland became both refuge and restriction, humane by design, inconvenient by necessity. And with every incident, the border became less like a wall and more like a line drawn on moving air. The Swiss could defend their sovereignty with guns and rules, but they could not seal the sky. The more the bomber war grew, the more Switzerland was pulled into it, not as an enemy, not as an ally, but as a feature on someone else's navigation problem. By the time the first truly catastrophic mistake would occur, the warning signs were already there. Aircraft crossing unintentionally, sirens sounding too often, judgments made too quickly. The stage was set for the moment when a neutral country would discover that, in modern war, being prepared is not the same as being protected. The bomber war's most decisive battles were often fought without gunfire, inside the quiet, technical labor of navigation. To the public, a raid looked like brute force. Hundreds of aircraft, thousands of bombs, a city burning. But inside each bomber, a different kind of struggle unfolded, made of pencils, clocks, and calculations done in thin air. Crews crossed Europe by wind drift and dead reckoning, by radio beacons that could fade or be fooled, by timed turns executed like ritual. Navigation was not a single skill. It was a chain of small certainties, each one depending on the last. That chain could break with one missing link. Bad weather could erase landmarks and reduce the ground to a blank, forcing reliance on instruments alone. Equipment could fail, needles sticking, receivers crackling into silence, oxygen masks freezing at the edges. A misread coastline, a river mistaken for another river, a city shape judged too quickly through haze. Any one of these could shift a course by a few degrees. And at 20,000 feet, a few degrees sustained for an hour does not create a small error. It creates a new destination. In the navigator's compartment, The work was both clinical and intimate. He stared at the drift meter, watching the movement of cloud shadows across the glass, trying to measure how the wind was pushing the bomber sideways. But clouds could mimic geography. Shadows could resemble coastlines. A river could appear where none existed, an illusion painted by weather, not by land. He squinted, adjusted, did the math again, and told himself what every navigator had to tell himself. The numbers are real, and the world will match them. In that moment, precision was not arrogance. It was necessity. Yet necessity can still be wrong. Formation tactics made the system more efficient and more vulnerable. The lead aircraft set the course. The rest followed, trusting the lead like a compass with wings. It was disciplined, coordinated, and designed to concentrate bombs on a single point. But it also meant that navigation was centralized into a few hands. When the lead drifted off course, dozens of aircraft drifted with it, obediently, faithfully, their crews seeing the same sky and telling themselves the same story. A single error could become a mass movement. This is where the moral weight changes shape. In peacetime, human error suggests a small mistake with limited consequences. A wrong turn, a missed signal, a minor correction. In wartime, especially in industrialized air war, navigation error is not simply a technical failure. It is human consequence, translated into streets and stations, into fire brigades and hospital wards, into names carved later into stone. The mistake does not remain in the cockpit. It arrives on the ground as fact. Switzerland's effort to remain unseen only deepened the problem. Blackouts erased city patterns at night and dulled recognition even by day when haze lingered. Winter light flattened the landscape, turning towns into pale clusters that could be confused with others. And on the enemy side, decoys and deception were part of survival. False fires, misleading signals, patterns designed to misdirect bombers in the last minutes of an approach. In that environment, neutrality could become invisible from above. Not because it did not exist, but because it could not announce itself through cloud and smoke. By 1943 and 1944, this fragile chain was being stressed daily by larger raids, tighter schedules, and weather that rarely cooperated. Crews learned to compensate, to improvise, to keep going when certainty dissolved. But improvisation has a shadow. It creates room for mistakes to repeat. Not as isolated accidents, but as a pattern produced by the system itself. And as Switzerland watched more formations stray across its borders, the question sharpened into something colder than outrage. How many times could "we thought we were over Germany" be said before it stopped sounding like an explanation and began to sound like a warning? Dawn over the airfields came with a specific kind of noise, engines warming in staggered rows, propellers biting cold air, ground crews moving with practiced speed beneath wings heavy with fuel and ordnance. One by one the bombers rolled, lifted and climbed, turning into the pale morning until they became a procession of dots. Then the dots multiplied. Hundreds of aircraft rose from separate runways and separate bases and began the same ritual: form up, find the stream, lock into position. Industrial power was no longer confined to factories. It had learned to fly. At altitude, the world looked clean. The chaos of roads and hedgerows disappeared. Cities flattened into grey stains. Rivers became dark lines that curved through the land like handwriting. The bomber crews carried maps that treated these features as proof. This bend means that city, that junction means this rail yard. But from 20,000 feet, a river can look like another river. A rail yard can look like another rail yard. Even the shape of a city can change under smoke, haze, and snow. The sky did not offer a window. It offered a surface, abstracted, simplified, and dangerously convincing. Misidentification was not always stupidity. It was often the natural consequence of distance. The human mind seeks patterns, and war trained men to seize them quickly. When a formation crossed the Rhine, the crews expected Germany. When they saw rails and industry, they assumed enemy purpose. In the bomber stream, belief could move faster than verification, Because verification required time, and time required calm, and calm was something the air war rarely granted. Then came the moment every bombardier waited for. The break-in cloud. It could last seconds, and it could decide an entire mission. A small opening would appear, and the ground would flash into existence. Tracks, rooftops, smokestacks, a bend in water. Relief would rise in the chest, not as triumph, but as permission. We can see. And in that relief lived temptation. The temptation to take the shot while the sight picture existed, because the window would close again, and the bombs could not be brought home forever. This was the struggle hidden inside the doctrine of precision. Precision demanded visibility, but the sky rarely provided it. So innovation followed, swift and relentless. Pathfinders went ahead, special crews tasked with marking targets, drawing the rest of the formation toward a single point like a magnet. Radar aids appeared, promising navigation and bombing through cloud, turning invisible cities into glowing shapes on a screen. Lead ships carried marking equipment, flares, and procedures designed to replace uncertainty with a signal everyone could follow. These were solutions born from necessity. They also carried an unintended danger. When the signal was wrong, it made wrongness efficient. Because marking does not merely guide, it persuades. A flare on the ground, a radar return that seems to match the briefing, a lead crew calling a correction over the radio, these things quiet dissent inside a formation. They make dozens of crews accept a decision they did not personally verify. In good conditions, that discipline concentrated destruction on the intended target. In bad conditions, it could concentrate destruction on the wrong place with the same methodical force. And then there was the policy that revealed the war's impatience. Alternative targets. In theory, it sounded reasonable. If the primary target was obscured, strike something else of military value, rail yards, marshalling points, industrial districts, rather than return with bombs unused. It was presented as flexibility, a way to keep pressure on the enemy even when weather interfered. But flexibility has a cost when the ground cannot be read. Alternative targets turned precision into improvisation, sometimes necessary, sometimes catastrophic. For the crews, the logic was also practical. Bomb-laden aircraft were vulnerable. Keeping bombs aboard increased risk on landing. And there was the psychological pressure that built in every cockpit as fuel burned and danger was endured. After hours of flak and fighter threat, men did not want the mission to end with empty achievement. They wanted proof that suffering meant something. A burst of visibility over any rail line could look like providence. Here is the grim truth that sat beneath the entire system. When bombers cannot find the target, they still return with bombs that must be dropped somewhere. The war was not only about destroying the enemy, it was also about managing an enormous airborne machine, tonnage scheduled, sorties counted, objectives demanded. The sky filled with aircraft that could not simply circle forever waiting for perfect clarity. At some point, the bombs had to leave the racks, and the decision had to be made under pressure, fatigue, and limited sight. This is how the sky became a machine. The aircraft climbed, assembled, proceeded, adjusted, released, and returned, whether the ground cooperated or not. The procedure itself began to look like destiny. If the stream reached the IP, if the bomb run began, if the sight picture appeared for a moment, then the release felt almost automatic. In that automation, moral responsibility did not vanish, but it became harder to grasp. Not because men stopped caring, because the system trained them to act faster than they could reflect. And somewhere beneath that cloud deck was Switzerland, rivers and rail lines, towns and stations, the same geometry seen in German targets, yet carrying a different meaning. From the cockpit, neutrality had no color. Borders had no altitude. What looked like somewhere could become the place where bombs fell simply because it appeared at the wrong moment. The dread is not in the weather alone, or in one crew's mistake. It is in the structure of the air war itself, an industrial engine that does not stop when visibility fails. And now, with the bomber stream searching for certainty through gaps in cloud, Switzerland was about to become the somewhere. Morning in Schaffhausen began with the quiet confidence of routine. The town lay close to the northern border, shaped by the bend of the Rhine and the steady pulse of rail traffic that connected workshops, warehouses and homes. Shops opened their doors. Workers moved toward factories and offices. Trains arrived and departed on schedule. Life continued under an assumption that had guided Switzerland through years of surrounding chaos. That neutrality, carefully guarded, was a form of protection strong enough to hold. The sirens sounded, as they had many times before. Their wail cut through the morning air, urgent but familiar, and familiarity had softened its edge. Too many previous alarms had ended without consequence. Engines overhead, formations passing on, the sky returning to silence. People listened, paused, weighed the risk. Some headed toward shelters. Others stayed where they were, finishing tasks, watching the sky with the practiced caution of a country that had learned to live beside danger without being consumed by it. In one home, a child looked upward, drawn by the distant movement above the clouds. The aircraft were high and orderly, their formation precise, their presence almost mesmerizing. From the ground, they appeared detached from violence, machines moving with purpose but without sound that felt personal. For a moment, there was fascination rather than fear. Then the first bombs fell, and fascination ended forever. The explosions arrived not as a single shock, but as a sequence, unfolding with the mechanical rhythm of a planned strike. High explosives tore through streets and railside buildings, collapsing walls and throwing debris across intersections. Incendiaries followed, finding attics and rooftops, igniting fires that spread faster than people could outrun them. The station area was hit, workshops shattered, homes folded inward. In minutes, the center of Schaffhausen was transformed by the same logic that governed attacks on enemy industry. Overwhelm the area, break its function, move on. On the ground, order dissolved into instinct. People ran, then stopped, realizing movement offered no guarantee. Others pressed themselves into doorways or stairwells, counting seconds between blasts, learning the sound of bombs by ear because there was no time for explanation. Glass shattered in waves. Brick dust filled the air. When the bombing paused, it left behind a silence broken not by sirens, but by voices, calling names, asking for help, answering when they could. The cost revealed itself quickly and without ceremony. Bodies lay where streets had been moments earlier. The wounded filled makeshift aid stations, some carried on doors or carts, others guided by strangers whose names they would never learn. Dozens were dead. Hundreds were injured. These were not soldiers, not targets chosen in a briefing room, but civilians whose lives had been arranged around the belief that staying neutral meant staying clear of such destruction. Above the town, the crews believed they had done what they were sent to do. Through broken cloud and imperfect visibility, the target they saw matched what they expected to see: rails, buildings, smoke rising in confirmation. From altitude, the destruction looked correct, because destruction always looks the same from far enough away. The bombers turned for home believing they had struck a legitimate industrial objective, measuring success by patterns of impact rather than by names on street signs. Below, Swiss civilians dug with bare hands. They pulled at beams and broken doors, listening for sounds beneath rubble, working without coordination because coordination had been buried. Firefighters fought blazes that refused to be contained. Doctors made decisions with limited supplies and no time. In those hours, neutrality offered no instruction. There were no rules for how to process an air raid that should not have happened. No doctrine for explaining to families why a war they had stood apart from had arrived in waves of fire. The shock was not only physical, it was conceptual. Switzerland had prepared for invasion, for pressure, for diplomatic strain, but not for the experience of being bombed as if it were an enemy. The attack exposed a gap between legal status and lived reality. Borders mattered on maps. From the air, they dissolved into patterns that could be misread, then acted upon with industrial force. Schaffhausen became proof of a hard truth the bomber war carried everywhere it went. A mission designed around precision can produce destruction without intention. The bombs fell exactly as engineered. The crews followed procedure as trained. The failure was not in the machinery, but in the assumption that seeing something was the same as knowing what it was. When the aircraft were gone and the smoke lingered, Switzerland faced a question it could no longer postpone. If neutrality could be violated this completely by mistake, what did defense mean in the age of mass air power? Paper protests and formal language would follow, but beneath them lay a deeper tension, sharper and more dangerous, because Schaffhausen was not only a tragedy, it was a warning. And as the town counted its dead and tried to rebuild its streets, Switzerland began to consider whether sovereignty could still rely on restraint alone, or whether the next response would have to rise from the ground, armed and unmistakable, into the very sky that had betrayed it. After Schaffhausen, neutrality could no longer be treated as a calm, settled condition. It became a question asked in meeting rooms and watchtowers, in newspapers and barracks. What does a neutral country do when it is bombed as if it were an enemy? Swiss leaders faced a choice that looked simple on paper, but was dangerous in practice. Protest diplomatically, or prove that neutrality had teeth. Either path carried risk. One could invite repetition through perceived weakness. The other could invite retaliation from powers whose armies and air fleets dwarfed Switzerland's own. In Bern, the language of protest began to form, formal, precise, and sharpened by grief. But behind the formal words sat an older Swiss instinct. Sovereignty is not a feeling, it is an enforcement. To keep borders meaningful, they must be defended when violated, even if the violator claims it did not mean to do it. That is the hard logic of small states living beside great ones. Intentions are not enough. Only consequences move policy. So the military posture tightened. Swiss fighters stood on readiness. Anti-aircraft batteries watched the approaches, tracking formations as they appeared and disappeared beyond cloud. Observers with binoculars and telephones became part of a national nervous system, passing reports along lines that ran from border towns to command posts. The air war that raged over Germany now had an echo over Switzerland. Not bombs, but vigilance, waiting for the next intrusion to decide whether it was harmless drift or the beginning of another catastrophe. For the men who flew Swiss interceptors, the dilemma was intimate. A pilot could scramble, climb into thin air, and see the distant shapes ahead. Large, slow, four-engine bombers, moving with the heavy confidence of a machine built for endurance. Closing the distance, he would watch the aircraft grow from a dot into a body, see gun turrets turning, recognize the nation by markings on wings or tail. In his gun sight, neutrality was no longer an idea. It was a set of rules he was expected to enforce at closing speed. The paradox of the war was unavoidable. Switzerland might have to shoot at the very people fighting Nazi Germany in order to defend Swiss neutrality. From the Allied perspective, these crews were part of a moral campaign, a vast effort to dismantle German industry and weaken a regime that had devoured Europe. From the Swiss perspective, morality did not erase sovereignty. A violation remained a violation, whether it came from a Luftwaffe bomber or a liberator returning from a German target. In the air, the difference between friend and trespasser could narrow to a single line on a map, and Switzerland's response was not limited to fighters and guns. The country's neutrality rules had always included internment, and the air war now fed those rules with growing frequency. Damaged Allied aircraft crossed the border to escape German fighters or flak, then sought airfields, meadows, any stretch of land long enough to land. Crews emerged not as conquerors, but as exhausted men, sometimes wounded, sometimes shaken, sometimes simply relieved to have found ground that did not shoot back. They were met by Swiss soldiers with rifles and calm instructions. You are safe, and you are not free. Internment expanded into a quiet world of fences, schedules, and guarded routines. Airmen who might have been killed over Germany instead found themselves housed in camps or supervised quarters, living between courtesy and confinement. Switzerland offered humane treatment, because Switzerland insisted it was not at war. Yet it also enforced restrictions, because neutrality demanded that belligerent crews could not simply rest and return to battle. In this strange space, the same policy produced two opposing experiences: refuge from death and the slow pressure of captivity. For some airmen, Switzerland became a kind of salvation: warm meals, medical care, the knowledge that tomorrow would not bring another flak corridor. For others, it became frustration, a feeling of being removed from the fight while comrades continued to fly and die. Neutrality, in practice, could be both merciful and severe. It protected life while denying purpose. It treated men as human beings while treating their uniforms as a problem to be contained. This duality was Switzerland's revelation. Neutrality was not a shield that made the war irrelevant. It was an active system: guns that might have to fire, borders that had to be asserted, and camps that transformed armed airmen into guarded guests. Every stray formation forced Switzerland to perform its neutrality again, to prove it was real not through speeches, but through action. And the tension grew because the sky did not quiet down. The air war intensified as 1944 advanced. More raids, larger streams, more weather-driven errors, more damaged aircraft spilling across borders. Switzerland began to feel less like a bystander and more like a pressure chamber, neutral in law, yet increasingly trapped between great powers whose mistakes could land in Swiss streets and whose reactions could land on Swiss politics. By now, protests alone could not guarantee safety, and gunfire alone could not guarantee restraint. Switzerland was being pulled into a contest it never declared, forced to balance dignity against survival with every new formation that crossed the line. And somewhere beyond the mountains and the diplomatic cables, the Allied command structure was also watching, calculating what Swiss anger might cost, and how many more accidents a neutral nation could endure before neutrality itself began to crack. Diplomatic cables move faster than bombers, and they arrive with a different kind of weight. Within hours and days, Switzerland's protests reached American desks in language that was formal by design and sharpened by grief. The words were careful. Neutral nations survive by careful words. But the message beneath them was plain. A sovereign state had been bombed, civilians were dead, and neutrality had been treated like an inconvenience of weather rather than a fact of law. In the neat geometry of wartime communications, the Swiss were drawing a hard line where the clouds had erased one. For Washington, the danger was not only diplomatic irritation, it was legitimacy. The United States was fighting a war that demanded moral authority as much as it demanded tonnage, because alliances are held together not only by military necessity, but by belief. Belief that the cause is just. Belief that power is restrained by intention. Belief that we are not like them. A defensive response, an instinctive refusal, a shrug, an implication that Switzerland should have understood the hazards of living near a battlefield, would have been strategically poisonous. Somewhere in the machinery of government, a mid-level official sat with a report and felt that strategic truth became personal. He read casualty figures that were not abstract, dozens killed, hundreds wounded, and he understood, with the quiet clarity of a man trained to measure reputations, that the alliance's image was also a battlefield. Bombing errors could be explained internally as navigational drift, cloud cover, or procedural breakdown. But externally, to a neutral population pulling bodies from rubble, explanations sounded dangerously close to excuses. In war, the difference between explanation and excuse is often decided by the person who buried the dead. So the response could not be prideful. It had to be controlled, swift, and visibly remorseful, an American message that acknowledged harm without opening the door to endless recrimination. Payments were discussed, promises were drafted, investigations were ordered, not only to find what went wrong, but to demonstrate that a wrong had been committed. Money was offered because governments have few tools for repairing the irreparable, and compensation is the only language states possess once the real language, Prevention has failed. Yet money never arrives fast enough for the dead. A payment can rebuild a roof, not a family. It can repair a station wall, not the memory of the moment it fell. In Switzerland, grief did not translate neatly into currency, and anger did not soften because a number was typed on official paper. In America, officials understood this, even as they relied on those same tools. They were not trying to purchase silence. They were trying to prevent a neutral nation from becoming a resentful one. This is the turning point. Once a neutral nation is hit, the bomber war must account for something it hates: limits. The doctrine of daylight precision bombing had been sold as a discipline that could be mastered through training and technology. But Schaffhausen forced an admission that sat uneasily inside every confident briefing. There are conditions under which the system cannot guarantee its own promises. Weather can defeat the best plans. Navigation can betray the most careful crews. And when hundreds of aircraft move as one body, a single wrong decision does not stay small, it becomes multiplied. So procedures tightened, not because war had become gentler, but because consequences had become more complicated. Route planning grew more conservative near the Swiss border. Identification discipline was emphasized, landmark confirmation, cross-checking, a greater insistence on certainty before release. Abort rules gained weight. If the target could not be verified, turn back, even if the bombs remained aboard. Restrictions on opportunity bombing began to harden, because the very flexibility that kept pressure on Germany also created opportunities for catastrophe. None of this was simple, and none of it was complete. The air war's machinery was enormous. It ran on schedules, fuel, and a steady stream of crews trained to push forward. Tightening procedures meant friction. It meant missions that returned without releasing. It meant commanders explaining to superiors why tonnage targets were not met. It meant asking men to accept the most difficult kind of discipline in wartime: restraint in the presence of effort. And still, the raids continued. Factories still burned in Germany, rail yards still cratered. The bomber stream still crossed a continent under cloud and flak, carrying the same vulnerability inside its strength. But the myth of clean precision took a permanent wound. Not because precision was a lie, but because it was never absolute, and war had been speaking of it as if it were. From this point forward, every American decision about bombing near Switzerland carried an additional calculation. Not only what it would do to the enemy, but what it might do to a neutral neighbor, and what that damage might do to the war's moral structure. The sky had revealed itself as a place where intent could be lost between instruments and cloud. And even as Washington began to learn the careful grammar of apology, another truth hovered in the background, waiting to return. Policies can change on paper faster than habits can change in the air. The next time a formation drifted, the next time a bombardier saw rail lines through a break in cloud, would restraint hold, or would the old machine logic assert itself again? By early 1945, the air war had entered a weary phase, not weary in scale, but in spirit. Germany's defeat was approaching, yet the bombing continued with relentless momentum. War rarely stops when the outcome becomes clear. It continues because aircraft are already fueled, bombs already loaded, and systems already in motion. Momentum itself becomes a kind of doctrine, difficult to interrupt even when caution demands it. The late war sky was an unforgiving place for precision. Formations scattered more easily, stretched by long distances and disrupted by weather that refused to cooperate. Visibility often collapsed into haze and broken cloud, flattening landmarks into uncertain shapes. Crews were tired, not only from danger, but from repetition. Mission after mission blurred together: briefing, takeoff, flak, return, debrief. In that cycle, even disciplined men began to rely on expectation. At altitude, expectation could feel indistinguishable from certainty. Beneath the language of strategy lay another quiet pressure: bring the bombs home used. The phrase was rarely spoken aloud, but it shaped behavior. Unreleased bombs meant an incomplete mission, effort spent without visible result. Bombs also made aircraft heavier and landings more dangerous. The system rewarded release, not only as military success, but as practical relief. In that environment, restraint required more discipline than aggression. On March 4, 1945, Switzerland felt the consequence of that pressure once again. Over Zurich and Basel, bombs fell on the wrong country. The scale was smaller than the devastation at Schaffhausen, but the shock was sharper because it carried a single devastating word: again. The first time a neutral city is struck, the mind reaches for explanations: weather, navigation, chance. The second time, explanation gives way to suspicion, not necessarily of intent, but of a system no longer able to prevent its own mistakes. In Zurich, the day held ordinary motion. Trams moved along familiar routes. People stepped from doorways, adjusted coats, carried parcels, thought about appointments rather than air raids. Swiss cities had learned to live beside the sound of distant engines, to measure risk by tone and direction, to wait for confirmation before reacting. Most alarms passed without consequence. Normality had become a form of endurance. Then, an ordinary instant was broken by force. The explosion arrived without context, no warning that explained itself, no enemy declaration. Glass burst outward, masonry collapsed inward. The air itself seemed to strike back. In those seconds, neutrality offered no protection and no meaning. A neutral city was not supposed to experience this, especially not now, after protests, apologies and promises. Basel felt the same violation. A city long accustomed to living near borders and air corridors found itself marked again by a war it had not chosen to fight. And the reaction this time was different from 1944. Fear remained, grief remained, but they were joined by a colder emotion. Repetition reshapes tragedy. The first time feels like misfortune. The second time feels like disregard. Even accidents, when repeated, acquire a moral weight that explanations cannot lift. Swiss anger rose accordingly, expressed not in spectacle but in tone. Diplomatic language hardened, public patience thinned. Switzerland was not indifferent to the broader war. Many understood what the Allies were fighting against. But sympathy erodes when funerals repeat. Neutrality does not mean consent to be harmed again and again. For the Allies, the damage ran deeper than embarrassment. It became a question of credibility. Precision bombing had been presented as a moral distinction, a cleaner, more disciplined way to wage industrial war. Each bomb that fell on Swiss soil weakened that claim. Germany, watching from within its shrinking borders, needed no commentary. Every crater in a neutral country quietly undermined the image of controlled power, regardless of intention. The deeper revelation was about technology itself. Progress does not eliminate error. It can scale error, faster, farther, and more efficiently. More aircraft, more missions, more complex routing, more procedures designed to manage risk. All of it expanded capability. All of it also expanded the number of ways a system could drift while still believing it was correct. When thousands of sorties are flown, even a small failure rate becomes a steady stream of human consequence. Modern war does not abolish accidents, it industrializes them. By March 1945, Switzerland was facing a crisis of trust. Neutrality had been violated too often to be dismissed as coincidence, too often to be soothed by regret alone. The question was no longer whether one crew had been wrong. The question was whether the system itself, the vast aerial machine crossing Europe day after day, could truly control its power near a small country caught beneath its roots. Switzerland had long believed that borders mattered if they were defended. Now it confronted a harsher uncertainty. Borders mattered on maps and in law, but not always in cloud, fatigue, and expectation. Not always in the moment when a bombardier saw rail lines through a break in weather and felt compelled to act. As Swiss officials prepared yet another protest, the story began to turn away from the sky. The next confrontation would not be fought by fighters or bombers, but inside offices and command chains, where responsibility would have to be traced through procedures, decisions, and assumptions. Because after Zurich and Basel, the question could no longer be postponed. Whose mistake was this? And what does accountability mean in an industrial war where no single hand releases all the consequences? After the bombs fell on Switzerland more than once, the war opened a second front. One made not of aircraft and flak, but of questions. Investigations began to move through the Allied system like searchlights sweeping a darkened field. Reports were demanded, timelines reconstructed, routes traced back across maps. Responsibility did not sit in one cockpit. It moved through a chain: navigators and lead crews, weather officers and operations planners, briefing rooms where assumptions were handed out as certainty, and debriefing rooms where certainty was turned into paperwork. The process was clinical because it had to be. Every mission left a trail: headings recorded, times noted, radio calls logged, bomb loads tallied. Somewhere in those details, officials believed the truth would appear as a single broken link: a wrong turn, a misread beacon, a drift that was not corrected. But the deeper they looked, the more the truth resisted simplicity. In a system designed to multiply force, mistakes could be multiplied as well, and the cause could become a cluster rather than a point. Some voices argued for the weather: fog and haze, cloud layers that erased landmarks, winter light that flattened the ground into misleading shapes. They spoke of wind drift and the limits of navigation, of how easily a formation could slide a few miles off course without any single man feeling the moment it happened. Others argued for something less comfortable: impatience. The culture of targets of opportunity, the pressure to release bombs rather than return with them, the temptation to accept a partial confirmation as enough because the bombs were already armed and the bomb run already underway. This was the war within the war, not simply what happened over Europe, but what the Allied air forces were willing to admit about how they fought. Precision bombing had been framed as discipline, as a moral improvement over blind destruction. Yet discipline, under stress, could become ritual rather than judgment. Procedure could become a substitute for certainty. And when that happened, "we thought we were over Germany" was no longer just a sentence. It was a symptom. For the crews, accountability was not an abstract debate. It lived in memory. A man could sit through debriefing, answer questions, sign forms, and still carry an image that paperwork could not erase: smoke rising from the wrong streets, the knowledge that people below had not been the enemy. In the months after such incidents, some airmen described a peculiar silence inside themselves. They could say, truthfully, that they had followed orders. But just following orders did not quiet the picture of ruined towns. It did not undo the feeling that the machine had asked them to act faster than they could think. Switzerland's leaders demanded more than regret. Regret could be written in polite language and filed away. They demanded recognition that sovereignty was real and that harm was real. A neutral nation did not accept being treated as collateral error simply because the war's main moral narrative ran elsewhere. Swiss protests carried the careful weight of small state diplomacy, but underneath them was an insistence that is older than any treaty. Borders are not suggestions, and neutrality is not invisibility. For Washington, the calculation became moral arithmetic under strategic pressure: apologize, compensate, and adjust procedures, or risk turning neutrality into hostility. A neutral Switzerland could remain a stabilizing factor, an orderly refuge for emergency landings, a country whose restrained anger stayed within diplomatic channels. But a Switzerland that felt repeatedly violated could harden, tightening air defense, firing more readily, or allowing resentment to poison relations long after the war ended. The United States did not need another enemy. It did not even need another critic. It needed to keep the moral structure of its campaign intact. That is why this climax is not a dogfight. It is accountability, the question of whether an industrial war can admit guilt without collapsing into excuses. The system wanted clean answers: weather, navigation, fog. Those answers were often true, but they were not complete. Because behind the fog was a human choice, whether to release bombs without certainty, whether to accept an almost as enough, whether to let procedure replace judgment when the ground could not be verified. Accountability in such a system is difficult because responsibility is distributed. A navigator plots the course. A lead crew confirms, or believes, it has found the target. A bombardier releases. A commander writes the doctrine that encourages opportunity bombing. A weather officer issues the forecast that frames the plan. No single man holds the entire act in his hands, yet the act still happens, whole and final, on the streets below. Industrial war is efficient at dividing tasks. It is less efficient at dividing consequences. And then the turning point lands with quiet force. A modern power learns that even unintentional harm leaves a strategic crater. The crater is not only in Swiss soil, it is in trust. Once a neutral nation has been hit repeatedly, every future assurance is tested against memory. Every apology is weighed against repetition. Every promise of control is judged by what the sky has already done. The war would continue. Bombers would fly again. But after Switzerland, the Allied air campaign could no longer pretend that error was merely incidental. Error had become part of the story, part of the cost, part of the moral burden, and part of the strategic reality. And as investigators searched for a single culprit, they began to confront a more unsettling possibility. Perhaps the real cause was not one mistake at all, but a system designed to act even when certainty was gone. An engine that could still drop its loads, even when it no longer knew with confidence what lay beneath its wings. When the story is told only through Schaffhausen or through Zurich and Basel, it can still be framed as exception, an extraordinary error under extraordinary conditions. But Switzerland's experience was not a single wound, it was a pattern. Over the course of the war, neutral airspace and neutral towns were touched again and again by a conflict that officially did not include them. The incidents accumulated into a kind of ledger, measured not only in damaged buildings, but in sirens, craters, funerals, and the slow work of repair that follows every accident with a long shadow. For Swiss society, this created a contradiction that could not be resolved neatly. Switzerland was spared the occupation that swallowed so many neighbours. Its cities did not become front lines in the traditional sense. Its government remained intact. Yet the sky repeatedly proved that distance from the battlefield was not the same as safety from its reach. Neutrality kept armies out. It did not keep high explosives out. It did not keep the war's momentum, drift, and misidentification from spilling across borders. The evidence of that contradiction settled into everyday landscapes. A street rebuilt with new stone still carried the memory of the old one. A station platform repaired and repainted still held the outline of where rubble had fallen. In some places, memorial plaques appeared, quiet, factual markers that did not need rhetoric. Names, dates, and a short sentence were enough. A museum might record a loss that never returned, a collection damaged, artifacts destroyed, a piece of cultural continuity broken by an event that was never supposed to happen. The harm was not only bodily, it reached into civic identity, the feeling of permanence that neutral countries cling to in unstable times. For Allied crews, Switzerland occupied an uneasy place in memory as well. It was sanctuary and embarrassment at the same time. A damaged bomber crossing into Swiss airspace could mean survival. No German fighters closing in, no flak batteries trying to finish the job, a chance to land before engines failed. Some airmen remembered Switzerland as the place where they lived, when they might otherwise have died, where they were fed, treated, and kept alive under rules that were strict but not cruel. And yet, that same memory carried discomfort, because refuge came with confinement. Internment meant safety purchased with suspension, alive, but removed from the mission, disarmed, and watched. That duality mirrored the broader moral tension of the bomber war. From the planning tables, the margin of error looked like a technical concept. So many miles of drift, so many minutes of mistiming, so much uncertainty under cloud. But on the ground, The margin of error was a human space where civilians lived. It contained schools, factories, tram lines, bakeries, and bedrooms. It contained the ordinary details that war planners never saw from altitude, yet which absorbed the full consequence of a decision made far above them. As the incidents accumulated, diplomatic settlements continued, because states must try to close what cannot truly be closed. Notes were exchanged, carefully worded, deliberate, balancing apology with explanation. Payments were negotiated and issued, because money is the tool governments use when they cannot undo what happened. And yet each settlement carried an implicit truth. Compensation comes after the fact, and the fact remains. No amount of formal language could restore the original assumption that neutrality, once declared and defended, would keep the war at a respectful distance. The ledger also shaped Switzerland's internal understanding of its own posture. The country had long believed its security rested on readiness and restraint, on the credibility of defense without provocation. That remained true, but the war taught a harsher lesson as well. A nation can be disciplined, armed, and legally neutral, and still be struck by forces that do not need to invade to cause devastation. Sovereignty could be violated without malice, and that made it in a way more frightening. Malice can be deterred. Mistakes cannot always be. In the years after the war, Switzerland rebuilt and remembered, but it remembered with altered innocence. The alarms and impacts had carved a different kind of awareness into public memory. That the modern battlefield is not always where leaders intend it to be. It is where systems drift, where visibility fails, where the pressure to act outweighs the ability to know. And in that sense, Switzerland's experience became a warning written not in propaganda, but in stone and absence. The lasting consequence was simple and unsettling. The war taught Switzerland that neutrality is not invisibility. You can stand outside the conflict by law and still be pulled inside by trajectory. You can draw borders in ink and still watch them dissolve in cloud. And as the ledger closed, another question remained open, one that did not belong only to Switzerland, but to every nation that would later claim precision as a moral defense. If error is inevitable in mass warfare, then what exactly does accident mean to the people who live underneath it? The hardest word in this story is not bombing or neutrality or even mistake. It is accident. The word sounds gentle, almost cleansing. It suggests a slip, an unfortunate crossing of wires, an event without intention and therefore without moral weight. For those who drop the bombs, accident can feel like a shield, proof that the act did not come from cruelty. For those who live beneath the blast, the word can feel like a second injury because it risks turning a grave into a footnote. To speak honestly, navigation errors are real. Wind drift at altitude is real. Cloud can erase landmarks. Instruments can fail or mislead. Men can mistake one river bend for another, and do so not out of carelessness, but under conditions engineered by war itself, stress, fatigue, time pressure, and the ever-present knowledge that hesitation can be fatal. Acknowledging these mechanics matters because war is not improved by myths, even comforting myths. But mechanics are not the same as moral emptiness. A cause can be understandable and still be devastating. An error can be human and still be unforgivable in its consequences. There is a moment that captures this tension in a single image. Smoke rising over a Swiss town, seen from two very different worlds. On the ground, a Swiss family looks up at the dark bloom and feels a kind of disbelief that has no place to go. The smoke is not news. It is personal. It is the shape of a morning that will not return, the possibility that a neighbor is trapped, the certainty that neutrality did not hold. Above, miles away, an American crew sees the same smoke, perhaps through a gap in cloud, perhaps later in memory, and the meaning shifts. For them, smoke is often interpreted as confirmation. The target was hit, the mission achieved. And then, when the truth arrives, smoke becomes something else entirely, proof that procedure can produce harm without hatred, and that following the plan does not guarantee innocence. This is where the philosophy of the bomber war must be reassessed. Precision bombing was never merely technical. It was ethical. It claimed to be a cleaner instrument, a way to strike war-making capacity while sparing civilians as much as possible. But when missions involve hundreds of aircraft, when decisions must be made quickly under cloud and flak, the system can manufacture tragedy even when individuals do not intend it. It is not that every crew wanted to hit the wrong place. It is that the machinery of mass operations creates conditions where wrong outcomes can emerge as a product of scale. Scale changes the moral landscape. A single pilot making a wrong turn is an error. A formation following the wrong lead is a multiplication of that error. A doctrine that encourages opportunity bombing under uncertain visibility is not just a policy choice. It is a framework that increases the probability of disaster. In an industrial air campaign, tragedy can be statistically predictable, rare in percentage, frequent in reality. And when tragedy becomes predictable, the word accident begins to feel insufficient. Modern warfare also spreads responsibility across so many hands that no single hand feels it fully. The navigator plots the course, the lead crew confirms the target, the bombardier releases, the commander designs the rules, the weather officer provides the forecast. The planner sets the route to avoid flak and save fuel. Each role is partial. Each decision is small in isolation. But the consequence is complete when it lands. The result is a moral dilution that makes accountability difficult, even when everyone involved is acting in good faith. Industrial war is efficient at dividing tasks. It is less efficient at preserving a clear sense of guilt. This is why Switzerland matters beyond its own borders. Switzerland becomes a moral mirror, because it is neutral, because it is not supposed to be part of the bombing campaign, because it forces the bomber war to look at itself without the usual justification of enemy necessity. A neutral nation has no strategic value as a target. Its wounded civilians cannot be explained away as collateral damage in a battle for victory. Switzerland compels a confrontation with the war's unintended truth. That power can escape intention, and that precision can fail in ways that still demand moral reckoning. The temptation is to solve the discomfort with language, to say unfortunate, unintended, regrettable, to hide behind the fact that the enemy was worse, the cause was just, the war was necessary. All of those things may be true, and yet they do not change what the Swiss experienced when their streets were struck from the sky. Moral accounting does not require claiming equivalence. It requires refusing to pretend that good intentions erase harm. And so the quiet verdict settles into place. Technology can reduce cruelty. Training can reduce error. Procedures can narrow the margin between plan and outcome. But none of it can erase the human cost of a mistake once it happens. Because the people beneath the bombs do not live inside percentages. They live inside moments, moments when the sky decides wrongly that they are part of the war. And in the final section, we return to that thin space between instruments and earth, where a map can be wrong and still kill. Because the most dangerous thing about accident is not that it happens, but that it can happen again. Return, finally, to the cockpit. Because that is where this story began, and where its central illusion took shape. The same instruments glow in dim light. Compass, airspeed, altimeter, a clock that turns distance into minutes. The same clouds spread beneath the formation like a blank sheet, hiding the ground and inviting belief to fill the missing details. And the same temptation returns with quiet force. The temptation to assume that what lies below must match the briefing, because the briefing is all the crew has left once the landscape disappears. Up there, the world is reduced. Cities become shapes, rivers become lines, rail yards become dark knots in a pale field. Men trained for precision learn to trust these abstractions, because without trust they cannot act, and without action the mission collapses into hesitation. At altitude, they believe they are safe inside procedure. They are wrong. Procedure can steady a hand, but it cannot guarantee that the hand is above the right street. On the widest scale, the Allied air war did help break Nazi industry. It disrupted rail networks, reduced production, forced Germany to divert resources into air defense, and placed constant strain on an economy built for total war. That truth belongs in any honest account. But another truth belongs beside it, equally modern and equally unsettling. Power escapes intention more easily than men like to admit. When you build a system designed to deliver destruction efficiently, it will deliver destruction even when the knowledge required to direct it has been stolen by weather, fatigue, or haste. That is what Switzerland exposes. Not an argument that the war effort was meaningless, but a reminder that moral purpose does not make a weapon perfectly obedient. A bomb does not carry context. It carries only trajectory. Once released, it cannot be called back by apology or balanced by the righteousness of the larger cause. It does not ask whether a town is neutral. It only falls. Years later, veterans sometimes spoke of these moments in a different voice than they used for targets in Germany. When they spoke of factories and rail yards, there could still be the old language of necessity, hard, certain, defended by the memory of what the enemy had done and what had to be stopped. But Switzerland sat in a different place in their recollections. It introduced hesitation, less triumph, more unease. A veteran might say he remembered the day he found out afterward, how the name of a Swiss town entered the debriefing room and changed the meaning of the smoke he had seen. He might not add dramatic reflection. He might not need to. In the long quiet after war, some facts carry their own weight. On the ground, Switzerland rebuilt and continued. Streets were repaired, stations were restored, families mourned and then learned to live around the absence. The country kept its neutrality because neutrality had been for Switzerland a survival strategy as much as a political identity. But it kept it with altered knowledge. Neutrality was not a shield against modern reach. It was not invisibility. In the age of mass air power, even a nation determined to stay outside the conflict could be touched by its errors. The timeline closed itself in the usual ways governments close wounds they cannot heal. There were apologies, there were payments, there were official notes written in precise language, as if precision in words could compensate for imprecision in the sky. Compensation, in the end, is a language spoken after the real language has failed. The real language is prevention. The moment when a crew recognizes doubt and chooses restraint. Once that moment passes, every later sentence is written in the shadow of what cannot be undone. And that is the moral reversal that settles over the whole story. The crews believed they were striking Germany. They believed the ground beneath them belonged to the war they had been ordered to fight. History records something colder, that they struck the innocent too, not because they wanted to, but because the system they served could turn belief into impact with terrible efficiency. This does not erase the enemy's crimes or the Allied purpose. It simply refuses to let purpose become a blanket that covers every consequence. The bomber war was a machine of necessity and innovation, but it was also a machine that made human error lethal at a scale older generations could not imagine. And Switzerland, neutral, prepared, and still wounded, became the proof that even modern precision carries a human margin it cannot fully erase. They thought they were over Germany. Then Switzerland taught them what a mistake looks like on the ground.